Recording this over there, so this will be real visible. The blue light, the huge microphone. I should talk this way so you can actually see me.
Looks kind of like Iron Man, doesn't he?
Have you figured out how it works?
Yeah, it's on.
Oh, you're recording?
Yeah.
Now I have to edit it because I'm talking on it.
Nah, it's good.
Are you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay. All right, so welcome to Joint SpiceCorps New York and DFW. I am Scott Allen Miller. I am practice lead in the Niagara Technology Group. Everyone should know who I am because I've been talking for hours now. We are here in the DFW doing our very first casual bar nights. We just have a few people here to hang out and be a little bit less formal. And we're doing our first joint presentation with New York, which is very cool. And you can kind of see, if you're on the video, you can kind of see everyone over there. They can't actually see you, so you don't have to wave, but it just kind of shows up as a screen, sort of. But we're also coordinating tonight's talk with the upcoming, it was supposed to come out today, but we didn't manage to get it done in time, Spotlight series in SpiceWorks covering OBR10. So I believe that's going to be out next week or the week after. I'm not quite sure of the schedule, but it is submitted, and I know it's coming out. So you won't have it tomorrow, but in about a week you will actually have this write-up published on SpiceWorks. And then 90 days later on SMB IT Journal. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, we're going to keep it kind of light and short, is OBR10, the new standard for server storage. So historically, in the late 1990s, we began to codify standards, rules of thumb for enterprise systems. For servers, this eventually came out as what we called RAID 1 plus RAID 5. This came out in the mid-90s, probably around 1995 is when we started seeing this predominantly at first, and then by around 1998 this was incredibly well established in kind of the lore and mythology of IT. Pretty much everyone at that time, it was the height of Microsoft training. Microsoft published on the NT4 platform that the preferred method for building a server in most cases was to have two arrays split with RAID 1 for the operating system, RAID 5 for data and anything else. And of course, special needs would always pull you away from that. You had a really small server doing very light needs, you might only have the RAID 1. You have a huge server doing lots of things, you might have multiple RAID 5s. If you had logging, such as a SQL server, you would add an extra RAID 1 for logging. There were lots of ways to expand it, but the core, the kind of standard point of reference was RAID 1 plus RAID 5. And there's a lot of reasons that we chose this at that time, and they made sense. A lot of people think that because things might be different now that it wasn't okay then, and that's not true. RAID 1 plus RAID 5 made a lot of sense in the mid to late 1990s. The reasons for that were that RAID 5 is fragile, but it's cheap. And storage at the time was very expensive. So it was critical in the late 90s that any storage that you were researching was going to be able to handle lowering the cost of storage, because it was just dreadfully expensive to get enough storage. We're talking about disks. When this first came out, only 1 gig on a SCSI disk. By the late 90s, around 1998, we're talking about 4.3 gig SCSI disks. So to get any amount of storage, enough for your operating system, enough for a database, enough for really anything, a couple of photographs, and you're looking at many SCSI disks. So it's very challenging to come up with enough storage. So because of that, RAID 5 is very capacity sensitive and allows you to get a lot of capacity out of the smallest number of disks while still having some redundancy. So RAID 5 was pushed very heavily. But because RAID 5 was fragile, we also leaned on RAID 1 to keep the operating system safe, because RAID 5 was just too dangerous to use for the operating system. So this was a popular combination. It also split up the file system. File systems could only grow so large at the time. The total capacities were often very, very low, especially in 1995 when you're coming off of the FAT16 and FAT32 era before NTFS really took off. So it started easing off in the mid-90s, but it was still a major concern for quite some time. But even when size wasn't a concern, file system fragility was a big concern. It was very, very common for people to have your file systems corrupt. Your disk might survive, your array might survive, but your file system itself would corrupt, and you would lose your data. So having separation of domains for different file systems was important back then. There was also a lot of concern around contention. Because RAID 5 and RAID 1 behave very differently, it was important to put files onto RAID 1 that performed well with RAID 1, such as operating systems and logs, and very important to keep on RAID 5 things that worked well with that type of, with the parity and random access. So typically databases and logs, databases and other non-sequential reads were very effective on RAID 5 comparatively as a dollar per performance. ratio. So it was really a matter of making the best of what was available at the time. If you had millions and millions of dollars, it was not the way you wanted to go. If your data was insanely critical, it was not the way to go. But for the bulk of companies, as a starting point, as a rule of thumb for where to begin your investigation of setting up a server, you pretty much couldn't go dramatically wrong using the RAID 1 plus RAID 5 setup. And that's why it became a rule of thumb. And then what happened was the entire industry of IT really kind of solidified in the mid to late 90s. Prior to that, it was a very niche industry. It was mostly filled by people who did not work in IT or were not educated in IT. IT professionals typically came from electrical engineering and other disciplines and moved into IT. So they weren't trained specifically in the needs of IT. They were trained in other areas. They came to IT, and by the late 90s, enough people had come together. We've been doing it long enough. Standards began to emerge, and because of that, we began to have the very first set of rules of thumb, the very first guidelines, the very first, all that stuff came together in the late 90s for the very first time. And because of that, the standard of RAID 1 plus RAID 5, being the original codified standard, has survived through the years unquestioned, because that first generation of IT professionals, which sadly I'm actually older than, made it through, and people who have entered the field since then either entered during an era where they were reading, they would look up material and see it from that era, which is the last time that there was a lot of research put into it, or they would talk to their mentors, who are people like me, or people who've been around since the 80s and 90s, and that's what we learned. We were drilled on RAID 1 plus RAID 5, and we were given all the reasons why it was important. But the average IT professional either did not learn the underlying causes or did not remember the underlying causes as we move forward. So as the factors that created the need for RAID 1 plus RAID 5 began to change over the years, we didn't necessarily reevaluate as we went, and we had already learned the correct way to do things, and so it remained for a very long time. So as we fast forward and look at the mid to late 2000s, what we have is a very dramatic change in how storage physically works. Physical disks have changed in many ways. File systems have become very, very reliable. We have new technologies like journaling, which first came in IBM's JFS, but made its way into IRIX's XFS, and eventually into ext3 for Linux, and ZFS for Solaris, and NTFS5 for Windows. So eventually journaling came out and was in just about every major enterprise file system out there. And with journaling, we really have given up the need for concern around file system fragility. File systems survive. People just don't lose file systems anymore. It's not a reasonable concern. If you're really looking at protecting a file system, you typically are going to go to backup, not to find some way to mitigate an actual file system disaster. Disks themselves have gotten much larger. Instead of 4 gig, which was typical in '98, we're now looking at about 3 terabytes that we're deploying on many new servers coming out today, if storage is a concern. We actually buy smaller than the largest because we don't need that big, and we actually look to save money. We never used to do that in 1998. We literally would buy whatever was the second largest drive available on the market. If 9 gig had just come out, we'd buy 4.3 because 9 would be unreasonably expensive, and everyone else would want 4.3 because there's no way you wanted anything smaller, but you couldn't afford anything bigger. That was just what we did. When 18 gig came out, we all bought 9s. When 36 came out, we all bought 18s, and so on. Now that has changed. 3 terabyte is out, but we still buy 300s and 400s and 500s and 1 terabytes because we are scaling for what we could possibly never use, not an impossible number, which 3 terabyte often gives us. So our sizes are enormous. We deploy big storage simply because we can, not because we need to. Disks themselves have become very reliable. A 4.3 gig SCSI drive, which is very expensive in 1998, would likely fail after 2 or 3 years. The life expectancy of drives was very low, even very good ones. Today, very cheap drives that you can go to Fry's or Best Buy and pick up for $110, $120 might have an expected lifespan of 5 to 10 years, reliably. And this has completely changed the game. We're no longer spending all of our time focusing on drive failure. We now look at other factors. Because the cost of drives has come down so dramatically, and because of other factors around speed and reliability, we're no longer concerned with the separation between 2 different arrays or 3 different arrays to protect the file systems. So because of this, we're now able to look at having single file systems spread across a single array, which solves many problems that we had previously. And because we're able to now get drives very cheaply with a decently performing enterprise SATA drive in the $200 to $300 range instead of the $2,000 to $3,000 range for a good SCSI drive back in 1998. Suddenly we are able to put in more drives for much less money, and it means we're able to look at technologies like RAID 10 instead of RAID 5. Yes, we spend a little bit more than we absolutely have to. We get a little bit less capacity because we have excess capacity, but with RAID 10, we obviously get much better performance and reliability that we didn't have with RAID 5. Because we've solved both the performance and the reliability problems, this naturally creates a situation where we no longer need the separation for RAID 1 like we used to. And because RAID 10 has the same performance characteristics of RAID 1, faster, but the same characteristics, behaves exactly the same, we are now able to merge all of our file systems together into one large file system on one large array that has one type of performance that's the optimum performance for almost every need, so that we actually have a much simplified system. We have speed, we have reliability, we have simplicity, which we are always seeking in IT. And in doing that, we have been able to create a new standard that really solves almost all the problems we were seeking before and focuses on new problems that we have today. And that the biggest problem that we have today is that the failure domain that we used to worry about, which is disk failure, is no longer significant. Disks are many times, orders of magnitude, more reliable today than they were 15 years ago. So much so that combined with their additional capacity, when we're looking at failure curves, when we're looking at a failure analysis for storage, what we're concerned about primarily is array failure, not disk failure. So array failure may come from any number of things. It could come from an array rebuilding. It could come from array confusion, what we call in the SpiceCorps community, we call it DAC, dreaded array confusion, which arises from a situation where an array begins to rebuild itself unnecessarily with no failed disks. This can happen. I've known several people who have had this happen. And under the right circumstances, DAC can not only occur and give you slowdown, but it may actually occur and overwrite your entire array with no failed disks. So when you get to it, you discover you have a perfectly healthy array with no data on it. No hardware failures at all, just no data. And this doesn't happen with RAID 10 or RAID 1 because there's no destructive algorithms because of the lack of parity. But RAID 5 and RAID 6 have the opportunity that if they become confused, they may destroy their own data. If RAID 1 and RAID 10 become confused, you'll still have a deterioration in performance while they rebuild, but the deterioration is minor, and when it's all said and done, you'll have no way to detect that a DAC has happened because they rewrite with good data over top of good data. So if they fail partway through, you're left with good data. If they fail before they begin, you're left with good data. If they complete, you fail with good data. So in all cases, they're stable. But RAID 5 and RAID 6, if they in any way fail during a rebuild, you lose everything. So it's a very different situation. So you get lots of protections. So the failure rates of the past have become background noise compared to the failure rates of today. And so because of this, we're focused on different things, and RAID 10 helps protect against the current types of failures, whereas RAID 5 was decently effective at protecting against the significant failures of the time. We didn't worry about those other things because disks themselves would fail so often that we weren't concerned about what at that time was background noise. We may replace a disk every year on a moderate-sized RAID 5 array in 1998. Now that's not the case. It's unlikely in a 5 or 6 year period of even a large RAID 10 array that you're going to have to, or any type of array today, that you would have to replace a drive because drives simply don't fail that much. And in statistical data, one of the things that's tough with arrays is that collecting statistical data on arrays is very difficult because there's no company that's going to go out, purchase 10,000 arrays, and run them for a period of time in different configurations and tell you what the failure rates are. It's not in anyone's interest to do that. The companies who sell them don't care. The companies who buy them run the math and figure out the failure domains with predicted failure and aren't going to do it for you because it would cost them money and they would not get the benefit. So at best, you're lucky to find companies who have done this on the large scale. I happen to be very fortunate that I work with a very large number of arrays, and I have over 10,000 array years of statistical analysis on one big RAID 10 arrays with single file systems on RAID 10, and we have had literally 0 array failures out of 10,000 array years. If you compare that to RAID 5, you may have a failure every 2 to 3 years on average, or slightly higher, 3 to 4 years, depending on what era you're looking at. Are we losing the microphone here? So if you talk to people with RAID 5, it's pretty typical to find almost every other person who runs RAID 5. And this is in small business. I'm not talking about enterprises with thousands of arrays. In a small business, it might have 2 to 3 RAID 5 arrays over a lifespan of an IT professional who's running those arrays, maybe 5 years. Chances are, out of 15 array years, every other person that you talk to will have experienced not just disk loss, but complete array loss on those arrays. And typically, and that data being collected today on 5-year-old arrays means we're talking 5 years ago when we weren't at the point where we were recommending RAID 10 yet. These are still during the era when we were just shifting over. So current arrays going in today are dramatically more leaning towards RAID 10 than RAID 5 than we were on the arrays that we're collecting information for. So that we're already seeing that 5 years ago that RAID 5 was a very dangerous choice, but we didn't have any way to know that until now. Now we have that information and realize that we're already maybe 7 years behind making the switch in most cases. So it's unfortunate. I'm very fortunate I'm in an environment where we actually did make the switch about 6 years ago, but there are still some lingering RAID 5s, and whenever we find them, it's a sheer panic. Because we know in an environment of our size, we lose a disk every 2 or 3 days. Right? We have tens of thousands of disks running at any time. They fail all the time. So when I say we have 10,000 array years of zero array failures, we're still talking about maybe 50 or 60,000 failed hard drives. Trying to do math really quickly off the top of my head. But we are constantly replacing those disks after they have failed. But we're not losing the arrays. We're not losing data. We have never had to go to a system rebuild in all that time. We will someday. You can't go forever. RAID 10 will fail. It's not perfect. But its chances of failure are so low compared to what we're used to that the idea of having to rebuild and go to backup practically don't exist. There are a few other small factors that also play into this that I just want to touch on real quick, and these are going to be in the article so people can look it up. Someone brought this up to me, and I had completely forgotten about this. This is such a separation. In the 1990s and even early 2000s, we used SCSI and parallel ATA. Those technologies had bus contention issues, and one of the reasons we would split arrays was simply so we could get bigger buses or more of them. Today, with serial communications, we don't have that. So every disk gets full speed going out to the array controller. So that's a need that most people have today forgotten, but for those who still have it in the back of their mind and wonder why that's not an issue, it's not an issue because we went to serialized communication. So that really has gone away. Another issue is contention. We used to talk in 1999, 2000, 2001, conversations around storage arrays would center quite often on contention. Do we know when the disk is being read? We don't want the drive heads doing different things at different times. And that's a real concern. Contention really does make sense, and we used to study very carefully storage domains and try to determine where contention would happen and how we could avoid it. And people wonder, well, why does that not happen today? Why can we have one big RAID 10 and not have contention issues? 2 reasons. One is because RAID 10 is simply faster. By being faster, we have less contention. If you have 100 cars that need to move down a tollway, and you're moving at 30 miles an hour, the chances that cars are going to be in each other's way is greater than if those cars are moving at 60 miles an hour. Now, in human terms, a car moving at 60 miles an hour and someone in their way might be more annoyed than a person at 30 with someone in their way. But when we're actually talking about data going down a pipe, the faster you can get the data out of the way, the more pipe there is available for someone else. So simply going faster reduces contention. There's just less workload in your way. That's minor. The bigger thing is that the way that RAID controllers work today is very different than it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, memory on a RAID controller was dramatically expensive and almost unheard of. If you were to have cache on an array controller, you'd be looking at about 32 meg. Tiny, tiny amounts, just enough to handle the calculations for RAID 5 and absolutely minimal overhead. That was all. You didn't actually get to speed anything up with it. Today, it's typical when deploying a new server. For those who've deployed in the last few generations, you're probably looking at 256 or 512 meg of cache. These are considered very small by today's standards, where a small controller might be a gig, a larger controller. I know people deploying just standard off-the-shelf servers today at 2 gig of cache. 2 gig is a giant, those almost mixed words, an enormous amount of cache. There's in a typical workload, 2 gig, you're going to hit a lot of cache hits in any given operation to your disks. And the most important part for contention is not the read contention, but the write contention, and the cache hits on that is 100%. So having a 2 gig cache can have dramatic effects on reducing contention. It changes the way that the disk has to behave, and it can optimize for its reads and writes much better. So that has really changed the game as far as contention and eliminated those needs. So you can put everything on RAID 10, and the combination is great. Beyond that, we also have what would be in CPU terms an L2 cache option available to us now. Some systems like Dell and others, but Dell is really big in this space now, has what's called Cascade available on their PERC controllers, and everyone's going to have this in the next few years, so look for it. But what this does is allows you to put SSD, solid-state drive, caches directly on your controllers. The controller handles everything and treats it as a slower cache than its memory, so you still got 1 or 2 gig of incredibly high-speed memory cache sitting right on the controller bus. But right behind that, you've got the SSDs with a huge IOP load, but much less storage. So you might have 100 gig, 200 gig of Cascade sitting out in front of a RAID 10 array, and that's going to give you a huge amount of IOPS and a huge amount of throughput that the drives themselves can't handle, and that you aren't getting the cache hits, and it kind of gives you that middle ground. So the combination can give you a performance of disks many, many times faster than their spindles would indicate. And it's also important just to remember that contention does not affect memory. So SSDs really don't have contention problems because they have random access. It's only spindles and the way that the mechanical arm moves that causes contention issues. So that is pretty much the technical background. So the recommendation going forward when you're talking about the standard for building a new server today, we call it OBR10, one big RAID 10. It doesn't mean it, just like the old standard, it's not for everyone. It doesn't apply in every situation. There will always be different scenarios where something else is better. But the standard, the place to start, is OBR10. And whenever you're making a plan for anything, start with OBR10. Assume that that is the place that, unless you have a specific need to go elsewhere, stay there. If you can prove that you have a technical need, move away from OBR10. Don't try to justify why you're using RAID 10. Justify why you're not. Just like in 1998, you had to justify why you weren't using RAID 1 plus RAID 5. That was perfectly viable at that time. But now, and it's also important to note that OBR10 applies to a dramatically larger set of circumstances than RAID 1 plus RAID 5 did back in 1998. So if you were applying that to 90% of servers 15 years ago, you should be applying OBR10 to 95% of servers today. And one of the hottest ones is standard SQL Server setup, Microsoft SQL Server, where they used to recommend RAID 1, RAID 5, RAID 1. Today, a single RAID 10 is better than R151 was 15 years ago, just like it is on a normal server, whether it's a domain controller, file server, exchange server, whatever. So you have that benefit that it just applies in more servers.
So that even applies to log files being on the same.
Absolutely, because the reason that log files are split off was the combination of protection because of the file system, but because log files are very performant when written sequentially, and RAID 5 has no performance advantage, or very little when it's sequentially written as opposed to non-sequentially, but RAID 10 has the benefits of RAID 1's sequential writing. So it's logs work great on RAID 10.
So you just build a big RAID 10 and put your OS and everything on that one drive?
Yes. So all in one drive. The one thing that you can do, and this is still a hotly disputed kind of piece of this, is whether or not you partition separately the OS from the data. You keep the physical array all one for sure. That's definitely the starting point and almost always applies. Partitioning off has its benefits and can be argued either way. It separates fragmentation domains. It separates things like log growth, right? So if you have logs growing in a log partition, they won't overgrow and affect other things. So it still maintains that there are times where partitioning out make the most sense.
Well,
what's happening in other domains outside of Windows, the Windows side still leans towards traditional partitioning, and those limitations can be kind of annoying. So in the Windows world, we tend a little bit to lean away from partitioning, only because partitions aren't as powerful there. But that will change. And in the Unix world, we lean more heavily towards partitioning because they don't actually partition. What they do is they use logical volume management, which is much more flexible, and you can scale it up and down, you can grow, you can do whatever you need, and you can use it for snapshots and stuff. So in the Unix world, you'll find that partitioning is very popular, and in the Windows world, it's kind of popular, and it really depends on your needs.
Well, it's getting better with the newer versions of Windows too.
Absolutely, and 2012 will definitely bring it.
Part of the reason I separated the logs, though, in the past, granted the RAID 10 performed better in logs, but also, if you did lose your database, you didn't want to lose your logs too.
Correct.
So, what you're saying is the odds of losing your array, your OBR10, are slim to none.
Correct.
But it will happen sooner or later.
It will happen to somebody somewhere someday.
Exactly. Now that poor SOB is going to be sitting there with his logs and his database gone. Not an enviable place.
It's not an enviable place. The real consideration is just 4 minutes. Okay, is that we have it's really risk analysis, right? How much is that chance worth, right? In my experience, 10,000 array years, we've had 0 failures. Is it worth $100 to protect against a failure that is that unlikely to happen? Or if you were to protect against every failure that was that unlikely to happen, would that cost your company millions or tens of millions of dollars for things that you would expect to never see in
So
1,000
then
years?
essentially what you're saying is the snapshots and or the backups are the protection you have against that rare failure.
Right. It's so rare that, I mean, it's not in every case. There are people who need to have their logs separate. And if you're dealing with a huge RAID 10 array of, say, 50 disks, certainly, separating out the logs starts to become really logical. And in a really large SQL Server database, for example, you actually wouldn't be using RAID 10 at the RAID controller level. And when you get big enough, you're actually making a whole bunch of hardware RAID 1s, and you're passing those off as individual containers to SQL Server, which will do a completely custom application RAID at the application level. But that's a completely different thing.
Right.
You're getting into really extreme tuning, which is good, but it's...
Right, we're kind of stuck in the middle right now. We've got, we had actually complete array failure not
Okay.
too long ago.
Of what kind of
RAID 5.
Okay.
It was Dell Equal Logic SAN.
Yes, they just finally admitted that they're not going to use RAID 5 anymore. Actually, we're going to cut the video because we're done with that, but we'll keep them going.